cover slide. So there we go. First one, do presentations way back when I was told always start with some sort of humor. So here you are for tonight. I don't feel like reading it to everybody. I looked for one that would be not the ones I keep seeing everywhere else. Everybody good? Moving on. Talk tonight, the topic I gave, originally I described it to John as a myco potpourri. He changed that to mushroom potpourri, same difference, or fungus potpourri, or basically I'm going to go through a few different topics rather than focus on one thing. Yeah, there's probably some bits you're going to go, oh, why are we wasting time on that? And I guarantee there's somebody else is going, oh, cool. Hopefully part of this you're going to go, oh, cool, I'm into that. So first bit, this one, for those who don't know, one of my things that I do on the side is handle calls from the Poison Center. So mushroom poisoning is kind of a topic near and dear to me. We had an incident this year that deserves particular mention. From the period March 27th to April 18th, a restaurant up in Montana decided it'd be cool and started serving raw or undercooked, depending on what day it was, morels to customers. As of July 19th, yeah, the FDA got involved. It was that many people. As of July 19th, 51 people are known to have gotten sick. The morels were identified via sequencing and other things as Morchella sextillata, which is a common burn mushroom and is widely used commercially as a mushroom. It's a black type morel. Very much used all over the place. Out of those 51 people, 3 of them ended up in the hospital. 2 of them died. These are not people, according to the FDA, who had prior illnesses. They weren't on the verge of being real sick or deathly ill or something beforehand. They were regular people who were healthy. I'm bringing it up because, I mean, we've always treated morels as, wow, if I eat them a little undercooked or raw, yeah, it's probably going to be a bad evening. I'm going to get sick. Well, you can now bump up your level of concern. You eat a bunch of them, you might not make it. So we don't get a lot of calls about people eating raw and undercooked morels. Good. Let's keep it that way. And I just wanted to emphasize to everybody, keep up the good work. Make sure you cook your morels thoroughly. The obvious question that comes up next is, how do you know if they're cooked thoroughly? Cook them. Ask yourself, are these cooked thoroughly? If your answer is not instantly, yeah, cook them some more. At some point, you're going to go, yes, they're cooked thoroughly. Now go ahead and enjoy them. Moving on to more fun topics. Photography. We haven't, since basically since the COVID thing hit, we used to have a photography contest every year. It more or less died. We couldn't have meetings here for, was it 1 year or 2 years? And since then, it's been kind of hard getting things back into the swing of things like they used to be. So I used to run those contests. In fact, they died previously, and I brought them back up out of pretty much nothing. And we had photography contests for, I don't know, about 10 years before COVID hit. I've spoken with Greg. Greg is our maximum leader next year. And yeah, he's saying we are going to push and try and actually have photography contests next year. That means we're hopefully going to have announcements in the newsletters and at meetings and remind people, hey, get your pictures ready, get them entered in there for the photography contest. I'm not going to give you details now. You'll get those next year. You'll have plenty of time because the contest, I assume we'll probably run it like we did in previous years. And that means that the actual contest where the voting happens is the cook and taste meeting. Instead of everybody socializing and stuff so much, we're going to have a presentation. The presentation is going to show the entries into the contest. And if you bring a laptop or a smartphone or something that can connect to the internet, you can vote on which photos you like and don't like. And we can come up with the winners right there. With that in mind, I thought it'd be cool, whether we were going to do that or not. We'll talk a little about how to do things and improve your photography. First thing, and this is the big one, and that's the thing I'm going to center on. Review your images while you're taking them. So if there's a problem, you can fix it. You can take another one and do better. We're in the modern age of digital photography. When I started this stuff, digital cameras were the sort of things that NASA had. They were very expensive. And the ones that a person like on public could get gave you little pictures that were, 320 by 200 pixels or something ridiculous like that, which is like, yeah, that makes a thumbnail now on your desktop or something. Now you can take pictures. How many people in here have a smartphone? Yeah, I'm betting your smartphones are more than good enough to take real good pictures. The majority of the pictures you're going to see in the talk, all of them were taken by my wife and I, and the majority of them were taken with our smartphones. You don't need very fancy equipment to do it. If you have fancy equipment, use it, but you don't have to. The 4 problems I'm going to cover. In other words, you're going to review your pictures. You're going to say, is this okay? Well, these are the 4 main things I'm going to say you should look at, roughly in order of how important they are and when So number 1, focus, 2, motion blur, lighting, and then composition. Composition you're going to do somewhat beforehand, but I'm going to go over some ideas that go with that. Focus. With a focus, basically, the important bits are not sharp, but usually something is. Can everybody pick out what's in focus in this? It's those little leaves up there on the right. I have no idea how the camera managed to focus on that, but what the heck? Usually if your image is out of focus, unless you're doing manual focus, it's going to have focused on something. And I honestly have no idea how my camera focused on that and all of that stuff. More usually you'll get this. This is pretty obviously an attempt to photograph those really cool forked gills. But those really cool forked gills didn't come out in focus, did they? I mean, instead, you've got the edge of the cap and a little bit of the stem is in focus. Well, for obvious reasons, that's not really anywhere near so, right? Not in there. There. All right. So, when you're reviewing your picture, pull it up, take a good look, and say to yourself, did that come out good or not? Be critical. I mean, let's be honest. You're the one that's doing it. Who's going to hear you unless you're out there yelling at yourself in the woods, I suppose. Just say to yourself, oh no, that's not going to cut it, right? That's what you're trying to get. And instead, this is in focus and this and that little area there. And the gills are kind of fuzzy. If I'm shooting that picture, I say, whoops, let's do that again. Honestly, this kind of picture is really hard to get right. That's where if you've got the fancy camera gear, yes, you can really force it to come out right. With your smartphone, it's likely to be more problematic. Motion blur. Motion blur is very similar to focus problem. And often you're going to misdiagnose it as a focus problem. The difference is that motion blur, everything that you thought would be in focus probably is, except that it's blurred along one path, usually a short line. It'll often look like you've managed a double exposure, so you'll get kind of a ghost image. This one, it's a little bit hard to see. Look right there. See the ghost on the edge of the jelly mushroom? There's a little bit there that's pretty easy to see too. So that's what happened. With a cell phone, what happens is you're moving your finger to click that shutter and the motion there triggers the other muscles in your hand, the phone moves. Usually when we're hunting mushrooms, we're underneath the forest there in the relatively dark places, and the result is there's not a lot of light, so you get longer exposures. This is a real good example. You might look at that and go, oh man, the focus is wrong. No, it isn't. Everything here, there's a double image if you look. That's motion blur. Now, how do you fix it? Well, my wife came up with a real clever idea to fix it with your smartphone. You can set your camera to trigger according to a word. So when she's in the woods taking pictures, she's all day out there going, smile, smile. Because now she doesn't have to move her finger to do it. She gets a position and goes, smile. Hands are not moving at all. Motion blur mostly goes away if you do that. Easy trick, makes life much better for you. Lighting. If you get your subject in direct sunlight, you're going to have problems. Basically, you end up with stuff that's really brightly lit and then these really deep shadows. So if you've got a situation like that, before you start taking pictures, one good way, since it's usually the two of us, she says, okay, shadow, get in the way. I go stand in front of the sun. I take my shirt and I go like this and I make a big shade area for her. And now she has some good shade. Here's a good example. The camera managed to do an okay kind of job underneath here. But up in there, it's dark and wow, up there, it's completely burned out. So that's a good example of the sort of thing that you would fix if you shaded it. Now, if you're out there on a day when it's overcast a bit, not real dark overcast, but you know, there's a nice layer of clouds in the sky. Perfect photography weather, guys. Your light is wonderful. You're not going to have problems. Here's another one like that. Yep, the sun coming down in these narrow things, and so you get obvious areas that are way too bright, and then right next to them areas that are too dark. If you can, get something to shade it. I've also known people who, when they go out by themselves, they'll bring an umbrella out there. The idea is they can set up the umbrella to provide the shade, and let's be honest, it rains quite a bit on a good year when you're out there hunting mushrooms, and an umbrella is a handy thing to have anyway. Composition. This is the part that a lot of people have trouble with. I'm going to give you a couple ideas to help you with composition. There are books written on this topic, and you can go take classes at, camera stores and places like that on how to compose photographs. If you really want to get into it, hey, go for all that. But understand, that's a deep, deep topic, and there's a lot you can go into. First one, well, there's our mushroom. Anybody think that's a good picture? I mean, let's be honest. We're straight up overhead almost, and boy, that guy is little. It's easy to lose him in there, isn't it? Well, that's better, but gee, could anybody even kind of guess what that is? I could think of several things it could be. As in, from straight overhead is usually not a good place, although I will admit the modeling of colors on that cap surface is kind of pretty. Now we realize there were 5 mushrooms there. And hopefully a lot of you at least can glance at this and go, oh, that's what that is. By the way, has anybody not seen the 5th mushroom yet? Good. So, yeah. Was there a 6th one that I missed? Oh, you mean that? Kinda. Yeah, maybe. Okay, so one of the tricks you can do to help with all this is move back. Too much of the time I see people trying to take their picture and they want their picture in the camera to be perfect. Don't do that. It's a lot easier. Scoot back, leave extra room, and now when you go home, you can go onto your computer and fix it. Or they have apps that'll load onto your smartphone that'll help you do the same sorts of things. So once you take a picture, get in more background than you think you want. Don't make it like that first picture, but get more background than you think you need, because your pictures have a lot more pixels than they need, and you don't need anywhere near all of it. So with that in mind, here's some examples to show that idea. How many people have you seen take pictures of people or groups of people this way? What they've done is you get the guy in the middle and you put their face dead center in the image. The problem with that is, look at the top of the image. You've got all this kind of empty space. Okay, it's a pretty background out there and everything, but gee, everybody's cut off about mid-thigh, and it's just like, oh, that's, at least to my view, that's not really a good picture. Let's move them up a bit. We'll adjust the framing. That's better. We haven't got that huge dead area at the top, but we're still cutting everybody off at the ankles, aren't we? Well, I'm going to argue that that's more of the image you should have gone for. Now we have a border around them. What I want you to think in terms of on this is, think also about the area that is not your subject. You want that also. That's important in your image. So in this case, you want to make sure that there's a good border of not the subject all the way around. You want it centered? Well, make the parts on the left and right about equal, and the parts on the top and bottom about equal. They don't all four have to be equal. By the way, that's the original image. And yes, the first thing I had to do, I don't remember who if I handed my camera to take the picture, but they've got it tilted by, and I figured that out when I fixed it, it's tilted by 4 degrees, which is not very much, but at least to my eye, it's, wow, that's kind of jarring. Not a problem. He's back there. The focus came out good. There's no motion blur. The lighting is nice. If I recall, it was kind of overcast. You don't see sharp, strong shadows under everybody. And so they backed up and got plenty of room around the whole thing. No problem. I could go home, put that in whatever program I use to fix my photos up, and I can make a nice picture out of that. What's more, I can make different versions of it depending on what I'm doing. Back up, allow some extra room in your picture. Notice how much extra room all the way around there is in this photo. Do that. You have the pixels on your smartphone. Go ahead and let those guys be there so that you can fix your photos a lot. Now we're going to change topics. When I see people go out in the woods and stuff on forays, what I notice is almost everybody seems to focus on the medium to large mushrooms, and the little guys get really neglected. And I just want to speak up for, guess what? Those little guys are really interesting. In fact, some of the coolest stuff you will find in the woods are the really little stuff. So let's take a look at some of those things. First, we're going to start with a topic my wife's really into, but I think they're cool, and there's a number of people who are: slime molds. Technically, these guys are not fungi. They were studied by mycologists for a long time. More recently, DNA shows that these guys are actually protozoa. They're basically a type of amoeba, all of them. Or I should say all of the ones that we're interested in. Colorado is a good area for slime molds. We get lots of them. We have lots of kinds of them. This is one that's probably fairly familiar. People find it in their gardens and lawns all the time. Fuligo, also referred to as dog vomit slime. In this case, I think the dog has something really wrong with him. Yeah, if that was my dog, I'd be like, let's get him to the vet right away. Yeah, these guys, that's a when this thing is fresh, this one's fairly dried, which is probably why the color. Um, it's basically one giant cell. All of the little ones have flowed together. It joins into one big cytoplasm with thousands and thousands of nuclei in it. And it's one big amoeba that's kind of flowing around on the ground there. They eat stuff like bacteria, some other fungi, little things like that. Diderma, which is a nice, pretty one, which you can see tends to grow on woody debris. By the way, a lot of these guys are also really, you can find a whole bunch of them around the time that the snowbank stuff is starting to come up real early. They don't care about the cold. Freezing doesn't bother them a bit. Bizarum. I'm sure you've seen these videos and things where they talk about slime molds that can solve mazes and stuff. You're looking at it. This guy is pretty common here in Colorado. And you can see from the background and stuff roughly how big this thing was. It's not unusually large. We found a number of these. This is Trichia. So it's getting into a later state. It formed into one big thing, and then they start splitting up into smaller things. Each one of these little BB things, because that's about how big they are, is basically a thing to produce spores. And they'll overwinter as the spores. Then next spring, and when the snowbanks are melting and stuff, they germinate from little amoebas that crawl off into the soil. So it's time to do this stuff again. This is Serratia mixa. That one's kind of amazing to find. It looks like little icicles. For those who can't see it, regrettably, the zoom bar thing up there's kind of obscuring stuff a bit. But at the top left there, you can see there's a Dacromyces jelly fungus that some of this is growing on. These guys are probably eating it, among other things, but that's probably a good deal of what they're going crazy about there. Stemonitis. These guys are kind of cool. If you look down at the bases, you can see they have little black stems. This is the one that's sometimes referred to as a chocolate tube slime. These are real young. As they mature, those pale cylinder things will darken and they'll kind of look like little cattails. This is another kind of Trichia. Instead of the red-orange, this one's a nice, pretty yellow. Yeah, these things tend to be, a lot of them, real nice colors. Having said all that, remember, most of these things are this big across. When I say little stuff, get your eyes used to looking for something little. This is one of the bigger ones, Lycogala. This grows on logs and stuff typically, and when they're young, they're like, well, it's bright pink. They're Pepto-Bismol pink, and inside they're full of liquid. As they mature, they'll turn brown and they look like some sort of puffball on the log. Yeah, well, that's reminding me, the name refers to their wolf's milk slime molds. Okay, let's jump off into ascomycetes. Those are cup fungi. For those who know their mycology a bit, ascomycetes are like 90% plus of all the fungi there are. But most of them are really little, so most people don't see these guys. They're worth looking for. There's a lot of them. Some of them are really pretty and stuff. This is some sort of Pizziza. Probably took this 10, 15 years ago. I don't remember what it was at this point. But it does appear to be some sort of Pizziza type guy. These were Tarzetta cupullaris, I think it was. Patinas. These guys were up really high up. They were subalpine. well over 10,000 feet. And each one of those things is about this big. So they're what, about 3 millimeters across? They're about. No, you can usually see them just walking. I mean, you can see it contrasts, right? It's fairly pale. Some of them you almost have to. And when we get serious, yeah, what you'll do is find an area that looks promising and have a seat. Seriously. And when I'm looking for ascos, one of the ways that we use is find an area that's fairly moist, start picking up little sticks and turning them over. You'll find ascos all over them, but they're tiny. Most of this stuff is a millimeter or less in size. This one's not tiny. This is good old Gyromitra esculenta. I'm not real good at morel hunting, so I find more of these than I do morels. Oh, well. For those who've gotten the bright idea, please don't think you're going to detoxify and eat them. I don't think we've had any fatalities in the US, but there have definitely been fatalities in Europe and Asia eating these guys, including by people who went out of their way to detoxify them. I'm not going to go into how you're supposed to do that, but don't waste your time. These guys we found this spring, those little white guys, you can see them kind of all underneath here. They were growing on this grass, breaking the grass down. They range from white to yellow. They have a little stem. In this case, it's hard to see it, but underneath there's really wet. Water was actually flowing there, and some of them were underwater. They didn't care. They're growing on the dead grass. These little white to yellow cups like this with the stems that grow on plant debris, almost all of them turn out to be this Hymenocyphus caliculus. I've looked at several collections of stuff that looked somewhat like this, usually different in sizes and colors, and boy, they all end up being the same thing. This is one of my wife's favorites. Let's see. Alex, are you here tonight? No, he's the guy that's running that Let's Have a State Mushroom thing. And he's also involved somewhat with the Let's Have Some Rare Mushrooms type stuff going around, which I think Amy Honan is mostly heading up. This one is a fairly rare mushroom. This is Microstoma protractum. They're about that tall, each one. And yeah, they look kind of like little orange tulips coming up out of the ground. Sometimes just one or two, or in this case, I found this one this spring. And there was a nice little group of them. They're not very common. They also have, for those who like to do microscope stuff, some enormous spores. Most spores of fungi are about the same size as a human red blood cell, which is about 7 microns. These guys, the spores are like 50 microns, huge by comparison. Lots of them here. This was up at a Telluride last year. That's Chlorocyboria, and you can see at the top where the wood itself has been stained green. As it breaks it down, the enzymes cause the wood to change color. The wood that you can find stained is pretty common. Finding them actually fruiting is fairly rare. You're going to find the wood pretty much any year and probably multiple times. You've got to have good conditions to find them actually fruiting like this. This is Helvella elastica. The picture makes them look fairly big. They're actually about this tall. So what's that, about 1.5 inches? Maybe 4 centimeters or so tall. Not very big. They occur in moss and wet places. You kind of got to go looking for them. We tend to find these almost every year now, if you go looking in wet, mossy places. How many people have found this? This is a spring guy. Yeah. Find this guy most years. It's around during the snowbank mushroom time and a little bit into June. Yeah, there's pretty obviously two kinds of cups here. The orange ones, which are the ones you spot first, are Bisonectria terrestris, and the dark ones are Pseudobrophila goldeni. These guys, in the literature, it says you find them where deer or elk have been, and they're like leaving off the last word, which is where they've been peeing. They apparently like a lot of nitrogen. But you can definitely, you'll find them in areas where it's clear the deer or elk have been hanging out. And usually I find them associated with aspen at the same time. So they're usually like all that white stuff and everything. Underneath that, there's a bunch of flattened aspen leaves that they're kind of growing on the top of. As far as I know, nobody knows why the two seem to grow together. But if you find one, you usually find the other. Now, as an interesting side thing, those brown guys, the orange ones, there's only a couple species, and the Bisonectria terrestris, that's what it looks like. And the others, there's only two species in the genus like. The other one doesn't look quite like that. But the brown guys, there's a bunch of species that are closely related. Several of them grow with Bisonectria terrestris. And as an interesting side thing, one of those species, the collection was made about a century ago. It was recorded in the Denver area. I don't remember the species name off the top of my head, but the interesting thing is it's a unique species and there's only one known collection. That's from Denver. So it's like, yeah, this is fairly common in spring. Once you start seeing them, you'll start finding a lot of them, but it's worth looking around because there are some species that look just like it and probably growing in the same areas and stuff and are actually something different. Well, this is one of the prettiest ascomycetes there is, at least in my opinion, Alvella crispa. For those who don't quite see it that way, that cap is actually a cup, and then it's got that stem, and the cap gets up there and starts to open up, and basically it's not strong enough to keep itself spread way out. So it sort of collapses part way and makes this weird shape. That just makes it so the stem supports it better. The stem just gets it up higher in the air so that when the spores are shot out, they can catch the wind a little better, go a little farther. This is another one of the snowbank fungi. How many of you found this? Yeah, not as many have found this one. These guys are actually only about this big, this tall. They can get bigger, but most of the time that's about how big they are. So half, 3/4 of an inch and an inch or two tall. They occur literally like on the edge of the snowbank. The problem is they're black. And when the snow moves away from them, when it melts back, these guys dry out and boy, do they shrink, which is why you don't find them elsewhere. They're probably there somewhere, but they disappear so small that you're just never going to find them. Black doesn't help either. Black mushrooms are tough to find. Oh, naturally, I put the name on there for everybody, and then it got hidden. Donadinia nigrella. It's not the name I originally learned. I learned Plectania nanfeltii. How they got to translate it to that other name, I don't know, but this one's fairly common in boggy, mossy areas. How many people have found this guy? This Bryoglossum. It's actually fairly common. They're little. They get maybe an inch tall. This one, it's a little tough to see details. These are Scutalinia. How many are familiar with those? Yeah, these are pretty. These are eyelash cups. If you look at them real close around the edge of the cup, it has little black or really dark brown eyelashes. Um, Most of the books only list one species, Scutalinia scutellata. These are not that species. You can tell because scutellata has fairly long lashes on it. These are fairly short. Going through collections that have been accurately identified in the herbarium, it looks like we probably have like 8 or 10 different kinds of this. Just looking at them, they look pretty close to the same. You need to use a microscope to tell them apart. They are fairly common though. It's just you got to keep watching for them. This, I'm sure, a number of people have seen. Yes, not that many. I mean, it's even growing here in Denver Botanic Gardens. These are Xylaria polymorpha, commonly known as dead man's fingers. Um, they get pretty good sized. We've had some come in that were that tall, that thick, and they're like wood. They're very, very firm and hard. By and large, what these guys are doing is breaking down dead wood, and there's plenty of dead tree roots out there in the Botanic Garden, where it's whatever, they had some little tree of some sort, something went wrong, it died or whatever, they cut it down. They're not going to go dig up all those roots. These guys are taking care of the roots for them. This is another one from in the gardens. It's an ascomycete. Um, I'm just going to let you know, these are basically true truffles. They're actually a close relative of the kind you would buy at a gourmet place for a lot of money. They're not very big. These were found in August. Basically, some of the folks who take care of planting the flowers and stuff out there, they were removing some in an area to prepare for planting something else. And they started finding some weird little things down there in the ground with them. Well, one of them got the bright idea, brought a couple down to the herbarium. We stuck it under a microscope and, oh, that's a real truffle. Went out and made collection, a bunch of them. The unfortunate thing is we couldn't identify them because they're way underripe. It was August. Truffles mature much later, like November, December. So we really couldn't see spores and stuff like we'd want to. Having said that, that's an ascus from a truffle and 2 spores. It's kind of cool, all those spines and those lines between. If you look out on the edge, you can see they're sort of like fairly transparent fence-like things that go between the spines. And those are fairly good-sized spores too. Kind of unusual too, only 2 spores in an ascus. Most ascomycetes, you get 8 spores at a time. Asci are usually not round like that. They're usually sausage shaped, more or less. In the ground and under oak. We've also had cases of people finding true truffles in the Denver area and in the mountains under aspen. Good luck. Seriously, the best way to find truffles and like that, honestly, which I learned from Jack States, that was his specialty, was when you're walking in the woods, if you see holes in the ground dug by squirrels or voles or animals like that, if it's not in a squirrel midden, they were probably digging for truffles. So what you can do is you find a hole like that. Yep, stick your arm down in there, feel around. You'll often find they don't get all of them. They only get 1 or 2 that are really ripe. You can feel around and find 1 or 2 in there, use your fingers, get them loose, pull them out, and end up with some fairly interesting stuff. I will tell you that most of what you find are not going to be true truffles. The vast majority that I've seen have turned out to be Rhizopogon and Gaudieria. All of the truffles and false truffles are edible. I'm not aware of any of them being poisonous. And in fact, their life cycle says they kind of can't be. They need to actually be eaten and make it through a digestive system in order for the spores to germinate. So if they were poisonous, that would sort of interfere with that. Um, Having said that, a lot of them are, I'm sure, not very palatable to people. I'm sure they're real attractive to squirrels and mice and voles and things like that, but their tastes are a little different than ours. This, this is an ascomycete that's parasitizing Boletus rubriceps. I'm sure we'd have preferred, most of us, that it didn't, but let's face it, these guys are out in nature and they've got a right to all that stuff too. Burn fungi. Here's another group that are real interesting. I know most of you think of, oh boy, burns, we're going to go hunt burn morels. And those who are interested, I'm sure, know about those. I'm not even going to mention burn morels. There's a lot of fungi that grow in burns. Most of the time when we hunt burns, what we look for is, while we're out there hiking, you find old campfire pits. Yep, we stop at almost all of those and spend some time looking through and finding stuff. It's kind of amazing, the variety of stuff, and they're different than you see anywhere else. So we've got this cool little shaggy Coprinellus that was coming up. There were a few of them, but that was the one that had the prettiest picture. I don't think we've actually identified this one yet. We've got collections sitting in the herbarium there in a box that we haven't gotten the opportunity to go and identify yet for, I don't know, 2-3 years worth of backlog. So one day we may get to this and figure out what it was. This one, this kind of pink orange thing. This is an interesting ascomycete called Pyronema. As far as I know, what's been identified, my wife usually does a lot of the ASCO stuff. She said it was mostly Pyronema domesticum. That has an interesting history for the name. Domesticum suggests that it grows like in houses or buildings. So it's like, I remember the first time we identified it, Vera, who was the curator of the herbarium, says, okay, how can it be domesticum if you found it up in the mountains in a campfire pit? That doesn't make any sense at all. Well, fortunately, I had actually looked it up and found that the history is that the first time this species was discovered was in France back in the 1800s. They were fixing up a house. They plastered the walls. Everybody went home. They came back the next day, and there were these stupid little pink cups growing all over the new plastered walls. Apparently, one of the things this particular ascomycete does better than almost anything else, it can grow on fairly sterile media, and it outgrows everything. It went from spores on fresh plaster to fruiting bodies in less than 24 hours. There are not many fungi that can manage that trick. Very, very few. So you're going to find these in places that have been sterilized, like a fire pit. They just basically pre-crowd out everything else. There's a number of pretty Pisiza species that grow in these things. And in particular, there's several species that have this pretty violet color. Don't remember, I tried to even look it up. There was one we found last year that we did go ahead and ID, kind of. We figured out, well, wait, this isn't Pisiza violacea, which is what everybody had been putting on them. Roy contacted Don Pfister, was it? I don't remember what the name was, but he suggested something. We got a paper, looked it up. Wow, all the stuff he described, perfect match. So okay, we're going to call it that. The interesting thing was the species that it was matching at that point, the only known collections were from the Southern Hemisphere. What was it, like Australia and Chile or something like that? And now it got found in Colorado. As in, he was saying, I'm interested. Can I get some of that to look at? Some of the, I mean, it literally had been named as a new species less than a year before, as I recall. So it's like, wow, that's cool. Okay, random other stuff. This is where we're going to move on. Before I get too far, much farther, and anybody have questions or stuff? No questions. That makes life quick and easy, doesn't it? Okay, this is a mycena, very probably Mycena hematopus. So it's the bleeding mycena. If you pick it and squish the stem, it's going to has this red sap. It's going to look like it's bleeding all over you. It'll stain your fingers and everything. But it's also got this zygomycete growing on it. That's a kind of mold. And at the tips of each one of those little branches, you see a little round thing. Some of them white, some of them dark. Those are things making spores for the mold. The dark ones, the spores are mature. The white ones, they aren't yet. Let me think. It was Syzyger, I think, was the parasite. This guy you find from time to time. But if you're not looking for little mushrooms, you'll never find it. You got to be looking and seeing the mycenas, and then you stop and look at them. And once in a while, you're going to find one and it's got another fungus growing on it that's even smaller. This is an interesting mushroom, only found in moss. This is Rickenella fibula. It looks kind of similar to some other mushrooms, but it turns out, as I understand it, Andy tells me it's not really related to much of anything else. These guys are parasites on the moss. So they can only live in this moss like this. And they're fairly unique. They're fairly separate from all the other stuff because of it. In particular, the stuff that kind of looks like it. Sorry about the bark and covering it at the top, but I'm sure you can guess more of the same. This is probably a button of Biospora occidentalis. That's a springtime mushroom that comes up. When I say button, when they're full grown, they're at best an inch tall. To give you the sense of scale, that log down here is a pine needle. So yes, I did some serious fun with a dissecting scope and camera to get this image. When the mushrooms are really young, boy, they have these hyphae just sticking out all over. And it's like, whoa, that's just, had to get a picture of that. I'm sure we've all found this, yes? Very common. Understand it's edible, although I can't imagine why people would bother. I mean, the individual things are real small, and I've not heard anybody describe them as particularly good tasting or anything. They're definitely pretty and make good camera subjects, though, if you're looking for something for the photography contest, potentially. This is another interesting one. This is a Romeria. At least according to the guides I look at, there's only one Romeria that we have that does this, that's yellow and has the green tips. Romeria abutinum. So it's one of the few Romerias that you can just identify. It's fairly common. If you find it in the right, you find the areas where it's growing, yeah, you're going to find a bunch of it. So I recall when we found this one, it was practically growing in a ring, about 6 feet across. That's one of our prettier mushrooms. Here in Colorado, this is fairly rare. Andy tells me up in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California and that whole area, it's actually pretty common. It's Cortinarius violaceus. Odd taxonomy biology fact. When we name a genus, a genus has a type species. That is to say, there's a species, and for any other mushroom to belong to that genus, it's supposed to be like that mushroom. This is the type species for the genus Cortinarius, which is like, oh, really? Needless to say, there are not a lot of Cortinarius that are very much like it. We know that Cortinarius as a genus is polyphyletic, which means they're not really genetically taxon, not physically related to each other. When they eventually do split it up, I suspect Cortinarius are going to end up being a rather small genus. Because I think the group that's near this, there's only 3 or 4 species or something. Just a kind of mind-blowing idea that the biggest genus, the type species, is not very much like all the others. The only things that are the same, has a cortina when it's young, the spores are rusty brown, they're ornamented, all the usual things like that. But by the way, for photography, yeah, this guy, if you can find him young and fresh, wonderful photo subject. This is another Cortinarius. This one is one of the ones you would use to dye fabrics. One of the cool things with this is when you go to when you're going to identify Cortinarius, one of the things you always have to do is look at the spores. It means you take a little piece of gill and put it on a slide. When you make a slide with this, all the liquid you put in there turns red because all the dye dissolves under the slide there. One of our lovely russula species. I know most people kind of think, oh, it's a russula. Well, they are pretty though. And if you're looking for photo subjects, they're good photo subjects. There's a lot of variety and a lot of neat colors and stuff. This one is one of the snowbank mycenas. I'm trying to think which one. One with a huge amount of fuzz at the bottom. Yeah, I think this is over Holtzii. You do see this thing, usually not solo. You'll find it like on a stump, and you'll find a lot of them. And one of the easy ways to tell is at the bases of the stems, there's huge amounts of fuzz. In this case, the growth of the mushroom was enough to partially melt the snow and ice so it could push up through. Makes for a neat picture, though. Oh, Gomphidius. They're edible, although I don't know anybody that eats them. For those who didn't notice, yeah, that's slime on there in thick gobs. The thing has so much slime on it, it's like somebody hocked one on top of it or something. It is slimy. I understand they're kind of slimy if you cook them, rather tasteless, but they're pretty. And they do make nice pictures. They're also, as I recall, fairly related to boletes, yes? Yeah. Which is kind of odd. I wouldn't have guessed that just looking, but it turns out they're fairly closely related to the boletes. Is there anybody who has not taken a picture of these? Seriously, is there anybody here who has not done that yet? I mean, this has to be the most photographed mushroom on Earth. It's in art everywhere. Happy to say that we're not getting too many poisoning calls from it. So people have got the sense that are not, if they're going to try eating it, they're not eating much. Yeah, please don't waste your time. I have talked to a lot of people, it's in well over 100. And the pretty much common refrain from everybody is, I wouldn't do that again. Okay. With rare exceptions, most people who try it thinking they're going to get high end up going, this is not fun at all. In fact, this is rather nasty. Yeah, please don't waste your time. On the other hand, this one's rather heavily sought after. How many people hunt these? How many people know what they are? Yeah, not many more. This is Matsutake. So if you're Eastern Asian descent, the odds are that you greatly relish this stuff. And boy, in late August and well into September and into early October, you will see a lot of East Asian people in the woods. They're almost always hunting this. They're not tough to identify. They have a very distinctive odor. Having said that, there are to my knowledge, two other mushrooms that have that same odor. There's Tricholoma dulceolens, which is a close relative of this. This is Tricholoma murrellianum, and dulceolens is also edible. In older stuff, you'll see people refer to it as Tricholoma caligatum. Our local one is dulceolens. And the other one, of all things, is Anosabe fraudans, which also goes under the name Anosabe periodora. I have found it a couple times here in Colorado, and it smells just like it. The problem is that the Anosabe is very poisonous. Doesn't look at all like this. It's a smaller mushroom. It looks like a fairly typical Anosabe, and it bruises red, which these guys don't. So, if you're going to learn to hunt these, at least like everything else, go with somebody who knows what they're doing the first time, who can point it out for you and say, yep, that's a good one. Go ahead with that. How many people ever bother to stop and look at what's growing on the poo? Good for you guys. Yeah. We do it all the time. Some of the most wonderful things are there. That mushroom in the middle looks like it's made of crystal. I mean, it's literally almost transparent, except for the little black areas, which are the edges of the gills where the spores are maturing. That's just one of those things that if you don't stop and look for something like this, you'll never see it. And you can tell, I'm sure you've all seen the deer and elk dung up there, so you know how big these things are, and you're getting an idea how big this mushroom is. It's not big. Yeah, the same day I took those ones that showed them out of focus, I also found some that were in, and this is probably the best of the lot. For those who don't know, that's enoki take. How many people know what enoki take is? Japanese food. Yeah, it doesn't look like that, does it? When they grow it to eat in a restaurant, they're growing it in an atmosphere high in carbon dioxide. And that causes them to grow deformed. Plus, they grow them in little narrow glass tubes, which helps keep them that way. In nature, this is what they look like. There are some things that are similar, but the stem being all woolly like that is a characteristic feature that you'd want to look for. This is a fairly common lepiota that grows around town a lot. How many people have seen this guy? Yeah. They're pretty. I'm glad I've never gotten a case of somebody eating them. Regrettably, I've had 2 cases from the poison center of dogs eating them. One of them, I don't think the dog made it. The other one, they said it did, but I was getting the call like 7 days later, and the dog was still in pretty bad shape, but they thought it would probably make it. This is Lepiota lilacea, fairly common around town. If ever you got the instinct to try it, please don't. There's reasonable chance that what it has is amatoxin, so the same stuff as deadly amanitas. That scaly cap, it'll have free white gills and a white spore print. And the thing that identifies the species is that ring on the stem. The underside of the ring is a dark lilac color, which kind of comes out in the picture. Honestly, we didn't get it from an angle for you to see it well. The ring usually stays on the stem pretty well. Anybody who's thinking about eating any lepiotas should rethink it. There's a bunch of species in lepiota that are deadly, and don't do it. I don't want to be the guy that takes that call. How many people have not found this? Are you just getting kind of started at it? That's why? That's cool. Everybody has their first time for finding these guys. Last year was not a good year for it. If we're lucky, this next year we'll get something more like normal or even good rainfall. The biggest thing for these is good rain. We get a good amount of rain. Boy, they'll be everywhere. They also seem to come up. I don't know how often we'll get a real good year. The last real good year we had for them was what, 99? I mean, they were literally everywhere. Um, you could go anywhere in the mountains, pretty much anywhere, park, walk off in the woods, and these guys were coming out of the ground every place. People were like, wow, how much do I want to keep? Regularly heard people going out in the woods and bringing back 20, 30 pounds a day. It was good enough that that year, I honestly got to the point where I refused to bend over and pick it up if it wasn't at least this big across. A nice trick about these, it takes about the same amount of time per mushroom to clean them. So if you only pick the big ones, I could get one of those paper lunch bags and fill that up with about, a dozen or 15 of the big ones, right? I'd get home, my stuff's all cleaned and ready to go in 15 minutes. The other guys who are picking all the little ones there, yep, they've got an hour's worth of cleaning to do when they get home. So when you're out picking them, leave the little ones. Just pick the bigger ones. Save yourself a lot of effort. You're not getting that much by picking a bunch of the little ones. It's a chanterelle. Yeah, this is Cantharellus roseocanus. This is our main chanterelle here. And for those who haven't seen it, I will let you know that my personal main recipe for this is I make chanterelle vodka. How is that? What do you think? You guys have tried it. I mean, it's like you get your bottle, you need to drain down a third of the stuff out of it by whatever means seems appropriate. And then you let the chanterelles basically dry part way out. You don't want them all the way dry, but you don't want them in their original state where they're really saturated with water. Then you basically stuff them in the bottle, seal it up. You want to fill the bottle back up. So all liquids all the way back up to the top. You should have chanterelles filling like most of the volume inside there. Tap it up, hide it somewhere and forget about it for a while. When you find it again, it'll all be a nice yellow. And yeah, you only need little sips. It's almost overpowering in the flavor. To me, that's what you're supposed to do with that kind of thing. You don't get a big glass. You get like a shot glass or something, and you just take sips. And it's like, yeah, that's really chanterelle flavored. The idea is if you dry it all the way out, there's volatile stuff that evaporates out of the chanterelles. If you dry them all the way out, that's all gone. You want that in there. So dry them out, but not all the way so that you're not adding water to the chanterelle, to the vodka. Are there people who haven't gotten this one yet? Probably just the new folks, right? This is probably the most sought after mushroom in Colorado. This is Boletus rubriceps. That's our king bolete. Note that the cap is usually reddish, although usually not as reddish as this. It'll often be more brownish, but usually has at least some pretty good red tint. It has tubes on the underside instead of gills. But the big thing I want you to notice, look at the stem and see that it has those nice ridges on it that make sort of a pattern like a net. That's critical. You need to see those, and they need to be light colored. The last thing you can check on, use your fingernail and scratch the tube surface. The tube surface should not turn blue or green. Should basically stay the same color it was originally, or maybe slightly darken. Very popular edible. And as I said, much sought after. The nice thing, they get big. Our Boletus rubriceps, I mean, much bigger than that. Yeah, we've got some pictures of us posed where they're definitely like that big. Single mushroom easily is 5 pounds plus. Yeah, you slice them up and dry them to preserve them. If you want recipes, look on the internet. There's more recipes than you have life left to try, I'm sure. This is one of our prettier mushrooms when you can find it fresh like this. We always are calling it Hidnellum peckii. I have seen in the literature that there's another mushroom that looks just like it. Apparently the difference is one of them is hot tasting, which is peckii, and the other one is not. Personally, I haven't started tasting them to figure it out, but maybe I'll find somebody to be the crash test dummy and discover that for us. It certainly makes for a wonderful photography subject if you can find it fresh like this. That's a Lycoprodon species, I think Umbrinum. Just interesting. The way those lines are on it almost looks like Frankenstein's monster got sewn together to make a puffball or something, right? Now, Scott Bates asked me for a copy of this photo and asked permission to use it in presentations. I'm like, sure, because that's his thing, of course. For those who are seriously into puffballs, this is the main one you're probably looking after. This is Calvacia buniana. This is our main large puffball. This one was kind of over near Kenosha Pass, roughly, and it was about the size of a volleyball. I didn't personally eat it, but I brought it into a meeting and I got swarmed by people. So I cut it into pieces about that thick, gave it away. For those who can't see, about 2 inches thick or so, and gave away the slices. And I think I got about 8 people like that. That was a lot of it. That's not a puffball. That's a scleroderma. We do get them locally, not as often as puffballs. I want you to notice this is the bit where we tell you to cut them in half top to bottom. Scleroderma, it's dark purplish inside, and you'll notice that the rind on it's fairly thick. These guys are poisonous. You will get very sick if you eat one. It used to be Polyporus squamosus. It's now Serioporus squamosus. This was along 6th Avenue. We were on the way in and saw it, and whoa, let's stop and take pictures. So we did. Yeah, the whole thing was about this tall. They're pretty obvious. They do make good photo subjects. I usually see them on maple around town, but I'm sure there's a variety of trees they can grow on. Some of them can get big. The biggest I've seen of it had a cap about like this. What's that, about 1.5 foot roughly? Big. For those who are wondering, yes, we're getting pretty near the end. I put in lots of slides because I didn't want it to run out real quick. Last time I did one, I did like 55 slides and then somehow got through it in like 35 minutes. I'm like, guess we're done. Didn't want that this time. This picture was taken from across the creek. This is a polypore also, but it's unusual that it comes out of the ground. This is Climacocystis borealis. It's unusual among polypores. Most of them you find they're real like wood. This thing's kind of soft and fleshy. It's actually a parasite on trees. And if you're seeing it coming out of the ground, that tree is probably pretty much doomed. It grows up and eats the heartwood of a tree, especially spruce. So the next time there's a good windstorm, the spruce this guy was coming out of is probably going to lose it. The neat thing with these, in a way, is that's what the pores look like. That's some of the coolest pores I've ever seen on the underside of a polypore. And when they talk maze-like, there you go. This is another really cool polypore. I don't know how many people have seen bright pink polypores like this. This one is not that rare. It's it used to be Fomitopsis kajanderi. Now it's what? Rhodofomes, because somebody had to move it to another genus. It's actually pretty common. It's also a parasite on a lot of our softwoods, spruce and stuff like that. Just keep your eyes open. These are not rare. This guy was actually growing in a Jeffco open space, so I couldn't collect it, unfortunately, but I think just based on the appearance and stuff and looking up a couple books, I think it's Enonotus rhacodes, which is a parasite on the trees and wipes them out. The aspen it's on was dead. And yes, this thing was like this tall. So it was, like 3 feet tall. I'm sure most of you have seen these guys. They don't look like anything from the top, but when you get on the underside of them, Tricaptum have, when they're fresh, these wonderful violet tubes. They often look kind of like teeth. That violet color pretty much gets you to the genus. If you flip over a gray brown type of little conch type thing and see this color underneath there, that's a Tricaptum. And then from there, identification of species is pretty easy because mostly it's based on what kind of tree it's on. This is one of the few mushrooms where taking a picture from straight up is okay. Yeah, there's lots of turkey tails growing around the botanic gardens, and I do find it in the woods fairly often. And they are definitely wonderful photography subjects. And as they say, that's all, folks.